Under the faint glow of the moon, Andre Cooper's worn boots crunched against the gravel of a narrow forest path. The factory worker, exhausted from another grueling 12-hour shift, yearned for the solace of home. But something stopped him, a low hum of an engine breaking the stillness of the night. Andre's curiosity turned into unease as he ducked behind a tree, his sharp eyes catching the faint outline of 3 shadowy figures digging furiously in a clearing. Moments later, the men heaved a large wooden box into the freshly dug hole. Their hurried whispers and the groan of shovels striking dirt hinted at a secret that wasn't meant to see the light of day. Driven by equal parts fear and an unrelenting need to know the truth, Andre waited until they were gone before approaching the mound. What he unearthed that night would forever change his life, and put both danger and betrayal on his doorstep.
Before we dive into today's story, we'd love your support. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your engagement helps us create more inspiring stories just for you. Now, without further ado, let's get started.
Andre Cooper was no stranger to hardship. Growing up in a small, run-down apartment on the edge of town, he had learned early that life didn't offer handouts. At 29, his days revolved around endless shifts at the local factory. The pay was meager, the hours grueling, and the conditions barely tolerable, but it kept a roof over his head and food on the table. Andre had dreams once, bigger ones than this, but they'd faded after the tragic death of his parents in a car accident when he was 17. Since then, survival had been his only priority. On the night it all began, exhaustion weighed heavy on Andre as he walked home. The shortcut through the woods had become a nightly ritual, a way to save precious minutes after his shift. The faint crunch of gravel beneath his boots and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind were almost comforting. But that night, the familiar quiet felt different. A distant hum of an engine broke the stillness, jolting him from his thoughts. Andre stopped, his instincts prickling with unease. Ahead, faint beams of light pierced through the trees. Someone else was out there. Ducking instinctively, Andre crept closer, his curiosity overcoming the sensible voice in his head, urging him to turn back. From the safety of the underbrush, he watched as 3 men worked under the cover of night. They moved with urgency, digging a hole in the clearing. One man barked orders, his voice sharp and commanding, while the other 2 shoveled furiously. The scene was eerie, lit only by the harsh beams of headlights, and Andre's stomach twisted as he wondered what they were burying. When the men finished their task, they hoisted a large wooden box into the hole with a heavy thud. Andre's breath caught. The box was too large for tools or cargo. His imagination ran wild, conjuring possibilities he wasn't ready to face. The men covered the box hastily, their movements mechanical and forceful, as though they wanted to erase all evidence of its existence. Andre remained frozen, crouched low in the shadows, until the men finished and drove away in their van. The forest fell silent again, but his mind raced. Every logical thought told him to walk away, to forget what he'd seen, but his feet refused to move. "This isn't my business," he whispered to himself, trying to steady his pounding heart. Still, something deep inside him, a mix of fear, curiosity, and an inexplicable sense of duty, urged him forward. Andre emerged cautiously from the brush, his eyes fixed on the fresh mound of dirt. His hands trembled as he knelt by the disturbed earth. "What were they hiding?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. Ignoring the voice in his head, warning him of the risks, he began to dig. The soil was loose and easy to move, but his exhaustion made the task grueling. Sweat beaded on his brow as he clawed at the dirt, his hands raw from the effort. After what felt like an eternity, his fingers hit wood. Andre paused, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The box was rough and splintered, with no markings to indicate what it held. His instincts screamed at him to stop, to leave whatever was inside buried, but his hands moved on their own, prying at the edges of the lid. The wooden top groaned in protest before it finally gave way with a loud crack. Andrei fell back, panting, as the lid clattered to the ground. For a moment, he didn't dare look inside. When he finally did, his heart nearly stopped. A young woman lay inside, unconscious and bound at the wrists and ankles. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, and her breathing was faint and shallow. Andrei's mind raced as he processed the scene before him. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice shaking. He scrambled forward, his hands fumbling to untie the ropes, cutting into her skin. "Hey, can you hear me?" The woman didn't respond. Andrei's panic deepened as he freed her wrists and ankles, grimacing at the deep red marks left behind. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. Relief flooded him when he found one, faint but steady. "You're alive," he muttered, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. Andrei glanced around the clearing, his senses on high alert. The men could return at any moment, and he had no idea what they might do if they found him there. He couldn't leave her, though. Whoever she was, she didn't deserve this. "Come on," he said, more to himself than to her, as he gently lifted her out of the box. She was lighter than he expected, but carrying her was no easy task after hours of physical labor. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing barely audible. The trail back to town felt endless. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made Andrei's heart leap. He kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting the headlights to reappear. By the time he reached the edge of the forest, his arms ached, and his legs felt like they might give out. His tiny apartment loomed ahead like a beacon. Andrei pushed through the front door, careful not to jostle the woman too much as he laid her on the worn couch. For the first time since the night began, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. "What did I just get myself into?" he murmured, staring at the unconscious woman. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and doubts. Who was she? Why had those men buried her alive? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do now? Andrei sat on the edge of the couch, his hands hovering nervously as he tried to figure out his next move. The night outside was quiet again, but the storm brewing inside him was just beginning. Andrei paced the small confines of his apartment, the sound of his footsteps muffled against the threadbare carpet. Sierra Walker, the woman he had pulled from the box, lay motionless on his worn-out couch. Her pale face was streaked with dirt, her wrists bearing angry red marks where the ropes had cut into her skin. He had cleaned her wounds as best as he could with lukewarm water and a rag, but she still looked fragile, as if she might shatter under the weight of her ordeal. "Think, Andrei, think," he muttered to himself, running a hand over his short, sweat-dampened hair. He glanced at the old wall clock, ticking loudly above the television. It was well past midnight, but the questions in his mind wouldn't let him rest. Who was she? What had those men done to her? And why? The faintest sound, a shallow intake of breath, made Andrei spin around. Sierra stirred, her head turning slightly as her eyelids fluttered open. For a moment, she seemed disoriented, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room. Then panic set in. She scrambled weakly against the couch, her breaths quick and shallow. Hey, it's okay," Andrei said quickly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "You're safe. I'm not going to hurt you." Sierra's wild eyes locked onto him, her chest heaving as she tried to speak. Her voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. Where am I?" "You're in my apartment," Andrei replied gently. "I found you. In the forest. You were—" He hesitated, not sure how much to reveal. "You were in a box. I dug you out." The words seemed to strike her like a physical blow. Tears welled in her eyes as she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. They buried me," she choked out, her voice breaking. I thought I was going to die. Andre crouched beside the couch, his dark eyes filled with concern. You're alive now, he said softly. Whoever did that to you, they're not here. You're safe. Sierra's sobs subsided into quiet sniffles as she leaned back against the couch, her hands trembling in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of the refrigerator. What's your name? Andre asked finally, his voice low. Sierra, she whispered. Sierra Walker. I'm Andre, he said. Andre Cooper. Can you tell me what happened? Why those men? He paused, searching for the right words. Why they did this to you? Sierra's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. It's a long story, she murmured. Andre settled onto the floor, leaning back against the coffee table. I'm not going anywhere. Sierra hesitated, her lips trembling as she tried to find the words. It started 3 nights ago, she began, her voice shaky. I was at a gala. My father's company was hosting it, Walker Industries. He owns half the businesses in this town. Andre nodded, encouraging her to continue. I left early, Sierra said, her voice growing quieter. Too many people. Too much noise. When I got to my car, I saw them. 2 men waiting for me. Andre's jaw tightened. They grabbed you? She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. One of them covered my mouth with something. I tried to fight, but everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in a basement. My hands and feet were tied. They thought I was still unconscious, but I could hear them talking. Andre leaned forward, his brow furrowing. What did they say? They were arguing, Sierra said, her voice trembling. One of them said I saw too much, that it was my fault. Andre's stomach churned. Saw what? Sierra's gaze lifted to meet his, her eyes filled with dread. A murder. The word hung in the air like a heavy weight. Andre stared at her, stunned. You saw them kill someone? She nodded, gripping the edge of the couch as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. His name was Daniel Harlow. He was one of my father's business partners. I walked into the wrong room at the gala. They didn't see me at first, but I saw them. Darius was there. Darius? Andre repeated, the name unfamiliar. My stepbrother, Sierra said bitterly. He's my father's son from his second marriage. We've never gotten along, but I never thought... Her voice broke, and she wiped at her eyes. I never thought he'd be capable of something like this. Andre's fists clenched at his sides. So your stepbrother killed this guy, and now he's trying to kill you to cover it up. Sierra nodded, her expression haunted. He's always been jealous of me. He thinks I've taken everything from him. My father's attention, the company's future. But I never wanted any of it. Andre leaned his head back against the table, exhaling sharply. And the guys who buried you? Darius's men, Sierra said. They argued about what to do with me. One of them wanted to let me go, but Darius said I was a loose end, so they decided to bury me alive. Andre's stomach twisted at the thought. He glanced at the red marks on her wrists, the faint bruise on her temple. She had been through hell, and yet she was still here, still fighting. You don't deserve this, he said quietly. None of it. Sierra looked at him, her expression softening. You saved me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If it weren't for you, I'd... Andre shook his head, cutting her off. Don't think about that. You're here now. That's what matters. For the first time, Sierra smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Thank you, she said, the words carrying the weight of her gratitude. Andre nodded, his mind already racing with what to do next. He couldn't take her to the police, not without risking them thinking he was involved. But keeping her here wasn't safe either. Darius wouldn't stop until she was silenced for good. "We'll figure this out," Andre said firmly. "You're not alone in this." Sierra studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Then she nodded, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. For the first time since she'd woken up, she felt a glimmer of hope. Andre stared at Sierra, her pale face set with determination as she sat at the small kitchen table in his cramped apartment. Her trembling hands clutched a cup of lukewarm tea, but her eyes held a fierce resolve that hadn't been there before. "We need to tell people the truth," she said, her voice steady despite the lingering hoarseness. "If Darius thinks he can silence me, he's wrong." Andre leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "And how do you plan to do that? The police won't listen without proof, and we can't exactly walk into a station without raising suspicions." Sierra hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug. "We don't need to go to the police. We just need to get the truth out there, online. If the whole world knows what Darius did, he won't be able to hide." Andre frowned, his skepticism evident. "You're talking about recording a video, calling him out?" "Yes," she replied firmly. "I'll tell them everything. About the gala, the murder, the basement, all of it. Once the truth is out, Darius will have nowhere to run." Andre rubbed the back of his neck, his instincts warring with the logic of her plan. "That's dangerous. If he sees it, he'll come after you, and me. We're already on borrowed time." Sierra met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "He's coming after us no matter what. At least this way, we'll have the world watching. He won't be able to make me disappear again." Andre sighed, his resolve softening under the weight of her determination. "All right," he said reluctantly. "If we're doing this, we do it right. No mistakes." The next morning, they set up in Andre's apartment. He cleared a corner of the living room, positioning his phone on a stack of books to act as a makeshift camera. Sierra, dressed in a clean hoodie Andre had lent her, sat in front of the plain wall. The marks on her wrists were still visible, a haunting reminder of her ordeal. Andre crouched by the phone, his fingers hovering over the record button. "You sure about this?" he asked one last time. Sierra nodded, taking a deep breath. "I'm sure." Andre hit record, and Sierra began to speak. Her voice was soft at first, but as she recounted the events of the past few days, it grew stronger, more resolute. She described the gala, the moment she walked in on Darius and his men, and the horrific realization that she had witnessed a murder. "Darius Miller, my stepbrother, is behind all of this," she said, her tone unflinching. "He orchestrated the murder of Daniel Harlow, a respected businessman, and when I saw what he did, he decided to bury me alive to keep me quiet." Andre watched from the side, his jaw tightening at the raw emotion in her words. "I'm lucky to be alive," Sierra continued, "but I can't stay silent. If you know anything about Darius Miller or his associates, please come forward. He needs to be stopped." When she finished, Andre ended the recording. The room was silent, except for their uneven breathing. "That was brave," Andre said finally, his voice low. Sierra offered a faint smile. "I didn't feel brave. I felt scared. But I'm done running." The video went live that evening. Within hours, it began to spread like wildfire. Social media platforms lit up with shares and comments. The hashtags had Justice for Sierra and #expose Darius trending almost immediately. News outlets picked up the story, replaying Sierra's emotional plea alongside photos of Darius and Daniel Harlow. Andre watched the chaos unfold on his laptop, his nerves fraying with every passing minute. "This is blowing up," he muttered, scrolling through the flood of reactions. "It's working," Sierra said quietly. standing behind him. Her relief was tempered by the knowledge of what might come next. Andre's phone buzzed on the table, the unfamiliar number making his stomach churn. He hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A low, gravelly voice came through the line. "You've made a big mistake, Cooper." Andre's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "You know who," the voice replied. "And you know what happens to people who cross Darius Miller." The call ended abruptly, leaving Andre staring at the screen in stunned silence. "What is it?" Sierra asked, her voice edged with fear. Andre set the phone down, his expression grim. "They know." By midnight, the apartment felt like a prison. Andre double-checked the locks on the door and windows, his anxiety mounting with every creak of the old building. Sierra sat on the couch, her arms wrapped around herself, as she stared blankly at the flickering TV. "We can't stay here," Andre said, pacing the small living room. "They'll find us." "Where will we go?" Sierra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Andre paused, his mind racing. "I know someone. Reggie. He's resourceful. If anyone can help us, it's him." Sierra nodded, trusting Andre's judgment. "Let's go." Reggie lived in a cramped apartment above a laundromat on the edge of town. He was a wiry man in his late 30s, with sharp eyes and a quick wit. When Andre knocked on his door, it creaked open to reveal Reggie holding a baseball bat. "Cooper?" Reggie asked, lowering the bat. "What the hell are you doing here?" "I need your help," Andre said quickly, stepping inside with Sierra close behind. Reggie's eyes flicked to Sierra, his curiosity piqued. "And who's this?" "It's a long story," Andre said, "but we don't have time. We need a place to lay low, and I need you to track something for me." Reggie raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "All right, spill." As Andre explained the situation, Reggie's expression shifted from disbelief to concern. "You've really stepped in it this time," he muttered, pulling out his laptop. "But I'll see what I can do." The hours passed in tense silence as Reggie worked. Sierra sat by the window, staring out at the empty street below. Andre stood nearby, his nerves on edge. Finally, Reggie spoke. "Got something." Andre and Sierra rushed to his side as he pointed to the screen. "There's a black SUV registered to a shell company linked to Darius. Last ping was on the outskirts of town, an abandoned warehouse." Andre's stomach sank. "That's where they're keeping an eye on us." Reggie nodded. "Most likely. If you're going to do something, you better do it fast." Andre and Sierra left Reggie's apartment before dawn. The address of the warehouse burned into their minds. The streets were eerily quiet as they made their way across town, the weight of their decision hanging heavy between them. "Are you sure about this?" Sierra asked, her voice trembling. Andre glanced at her, his expression resolute. "I'm not letting him win." The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking shadow against the pale morning sky. Andre parked a block away, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Stay close," he said, as they stepped out of the car. They crept toward the building, sticking to the shadows. The faint hum of machinery and the occasional murmur of voices reached their ears as they approached the side entrance. Andre peered through a crack in the door, his heart pounding. Inside, two men stood near a table, their guns resting casually beside them. "We need to be quiet," Andre whispered. But just as they stepped inside, the creak of the door betrayed them. One of the men turned, his eyes narrowing. "Hey!" he shouted, reaching for his weapon. Andre didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing a crowbar from the floor and swinging it with all his strength. The man crumpled to the ground, his companion scrambling to raise his gun. "Run!" Andre yelled, shoving Sierra toward the exit. They sprinted through the maze of crates and pallets, the sound of shouts and footsteps echoing behind them. Sierra's breath came in ragged gasps as she followed Andre, her fear driving her forward. As they burst through the exit into the cold morning air, headlights flared in the distance. A beat-up car screeched to a halt in front of them, and Reggie leaned out the window. "Get in!" he shouted. Andre threw open the door, pulling Sierra inside as bullets ricocheted off the pavement. "Drive!" Andre yelled. Reggie slammed on the gas, the tires squealing as they sped away from the warehouse. "They're still behind us!" Sierra cried, glancing back at the pursuing SUV. Reggie swerved sharply, leading the chase through narrow alleys and side streets. Finally, after a tense and chaotic pursuit, the SUV disappeared from view. Reggie pulled over in a quiet neighborhood, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. "You two owe me big time," he muttered. Andre and Sierra exchanged a look, the relief evident in their eyes. "It's not over yet," Andre said grimly, "but we're still in this fight." Andre paced back and forth in Reggie's apartment, his fists clenched at his sides. The events of the last few days had pushed him to his limit, but one thing was clear. Darius Miller had to be stopped. Sierra sat on the worn-out couch, her knees drawn up to her chest, while Reggie tapped away at his laptop. The tension in the room was palpable. "This has to work," Andre said, his voice tight. "It will," Reggie replied, not looking up. "I've got everything in place. All we need now is for them to take the bait." Sierra glanced at Reggie. "Are you sure he'll come?" Reggie smirked, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Guys like Darius? He won't be able to resist. The moment he thinks he can tie up his loose ends, he'll jump at the chance." Andre stopped pacing and turned to Sierra. "Are you ready for this?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't think I'll ever be ready, but we don't have a choice. He has to face justice." Reggie's plan was simple but risky. Using a burner phone, he contacted one of Darius's men, pretending to be a greedy informant who had captured Sierra. The message was clear. Sierra would be handed over for a hefty price. Reggie set the meeting at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, knowing the isolated location would work to their advantage. The police were already involved, thanks to the video Sierra had recorded. With mounting evidence against Darius, the authorities agreed to stake out the warehouse and move in once Darius incriminated himself. It was a delicate operation, and one misstep could spell disaster. The warehouse was a desolate, crumbling structure, surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted machinery. Under the pale light of the moon, it looked like something out of a nightmare. Andre, Sierra, and Reggie arrived early, parking a safe distance away. Andre adjusted the earpiece connected to the police frequency, his jaw tight with determination. "Stay close to me," he said to Sierra. She nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I will." Reggie surveyed the area, his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of movement. "They'll be here soon," he said. "You both ready?" Andre gave a curt nod, gripping the crowbar he had brought for protection. "Let's do this." An hour later, headlights appeared in the distance. Andre tensed as a sleek black SUV pulled into the warehouse yard, followed by two more vehicles. The cars came to a stop, and several men stepped out, their faces shadowed under the dim light. Darius emerged last, his expensive coat flaring slightly in the cold breeze. Andre's grip tightened on the crowbar as he watched Darius stride toward the warehouse entrance, his posture casual but predatory. Inside, Reggie stayed hidden behind a stack of crates, monitoring the scene through a small camera feed on his laptop. "They're in position," he whispered into his mic. Andre and Sierra stood near the center of the warehouse, their expressions carefully guarded. Darius entered, flanked by his men, his cold gaze sweeping over them. "Well, well," he drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "You really pulled her out of the dirt, didn't you, Cooper? I've got to admit I'm impressed. Didn't think you had it in you." Andre didn't flinch. "She's here," Now let her go." Darius chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't make the demands here, Cooper. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Sierra stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "You don't scare me, Darius. The world knows what you've done. You can't hide anymore." Darius's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. "You always did have a big mouth, Sierra. That's why we're here, to shut you up for good." He signaled to his men, who began to move forward. "Now!" Reggie's voice crackled in Andre's earpiece. Suddenly, the warehouse flooded with blinding lights as police vehicles surrounded the building. Officers poured in from every entrance, their weapons drawn. "Freeze! Drop your weapons!" Panic erupted among Darius's men as they scrambled to escape, only to be tackled and handcuffed by the advancing officers. Darius stood frozen, his confident facade crumbling as the police closed in. "This is a mistake!" he shouted, his voice desperate. "You have no idea who I am!" Sierra stepped forward, her eyes locked on him. "We know exactly who you are, Darius, and so does everyone else." Darius turned to her, his expression darkening. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, I do." The officers moved in, cuffing Darius and leading him toward one of the squad cars. As he passed Sierra, he sneered. "This isn't the end." She watched him go, her shoulders straight, despite the weight of the moment. "Yes, it is," she whispered. Outside the warehouse, the night air felt lighter, as though the tension of the past days had finally lifted. Andre leaned against a police car, watching as Darius and his men were driven away. "You did it," he said to Sierra, his voice soft. "We did it," she corrected, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Reggie appeared beside them, his laptop tucked under one arm. "Well, that was intense," he said, his usual smirk back in place. "You two owe me big time." Andre chuckled, the sound surprising even himself. "We'll figure something out." Sierra smiled faintly, the first genuine smile she'd managed in days. For the first time, she felt like she could breathe again. Back at Reggie's apartment, Sierra sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. Andre joined her, handing her a mug of tea. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "It feels surreal, like it's not really over." Andre nodded. "It'll take time, but you're safe now. That's what matters." Sierra looked at him, her gratitude evident. "I don't know how to thank you, Andre. You saved my life." He shrugged, his expression humble. "I just did what anyone would do." She smiled softly. "Not anyone would have risked everything for a stranger. You're one of a kind." Andre looked away, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "You would have done the same." For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of the past few days slowly fading into the background. The soft glow of the morning sun bathed the Walker estate in golden light. Andre stood at the edge of the driveway, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn jacket. The grandeur of the estate still felt surreal, a stark contrast to the small, run-down apartment he had called home. Behind him, Sierra and her father, Charles Walker, were locked in a quiet conversation near the front steps. Charles, a tall man with a commanding presence, had aged visibly over the past week. The revelations about his stepson, Darius, had taken a toll, but the relief of having Sierra home safe was evident in his softened demeanor. "Are you sure you won't stay?" Sierra asked as she approached Andre. Andre smiled faintly, shaking his head. "This isn't really my scene," he replied, gesturing toward the sprawling gardens and towering columns of the estate. "I'd probably knock over a vase or something." Sierra chuckled, but her smile faltered. "I mean it, Andre. You're welcome here. My father and I owe you more than we can ever repay." "You don't owe me anything," Andre said, his voice steady. "I'm just glad you're safe." Inside the estate, Charles joined them, holding an envelope in his hand. "Andre," he began, his tone formal yet warm. "I can't begin to express my gratitude for what you've done for my daughter. You risked everything to save her, and for that, you'll always have our thanks." Andre nodded, unsure how to respond. Charles extended the envelope toward him. "I'd like to offer you something, a chance to start fresh. Inside is a check that will cover your education, living expenses, and anything else you might need to build the life you deserve." Andre hesitated, staring at the envelope as though it was something foreign. "I can't take this," he said finally, his voice low. "Yes, you can," Sierra interjected, her tone firm but kind. "You've spent your whole life helping others, Andre. It's time someone helped you." Andre looked between them, his throat tight. The dreams he had buried long ago began to resurface, going to college, building a career, creating a future he could be proud of. "Thank you," he said quietly, taking the envelope. A few weeks later, Andre sat in the back of a college library, surrounded by textbooks and notebooks filled with his neat handwriting. The sun filtered through the tall windows, casting warm patterns on the table. He had been hesitant at first, but once he began his classes, he found a renewed sense of purpose. As he scribbled notes for an upcoming paper, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Cooper?" Andre looked up to see his professor standing beside him, holding a graded essay. "Excellent work," she said with a smile, handing him the paper. "You're proving to be one of my top students." Andre stared at the crisp A scrawled at the top of the page, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice steady. The professor nodded and walked away, leaving Andre to reflect on how far he had come. For the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. Meanwhile, Sierra was navigating her own journey of healing and reconciliation. She had moved back into her father's estate, slowly repairing the strained relationship caused by years of distance and misunderstanding. Charles, now more present and attentive than ever, worked tirelessly to rebuild the trust they had lost. One afternoon, Sierra stood in the estate's garden, watching the sunlight dance on the surface of the fountain. Her father joined her, his expression thoughtful. "I still can't believe what Darius did," Charles said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "I should have seen the signs." "You couldn't have known," Sierra replied, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "What matters is that we're here now. We can move forward." Charles nodded, his shoulders straightening. "You're right, and I promise to do better, not just for the company, but for you." Sierra smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Despite their separate paths, Sierra and Andre remained close. They kept in touch regularly, exchanging updates and offering each other support. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Andre sat on a park bench, his elbows resting on his knees. The vibrant hues of the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sierra approached quietly, her steps soft on the gravel path. "Hey," she said, sitting beside him. Andre smiled faintly. "Hey." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the colors deepen. "How's school?" Sierra asked, nudging him playfully. "Hard," Andre admitted, chuckling. "But it feels good to be working toward something." Sierra nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way." "So have you," Andre replied, glancing at her. Sierra smiled, a warmth in her gaze. "I couldn't have done it without you." Andre hesitated, then said softly, "You saved me too, Sierra. I didn't think much about the future before all this. You gave me something to believe in again." Sierra looked at him, her voice quiet but firm. "We saved each other." The first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, their faint light reflecting in Sierra's eyes. Andre leaned back, a rare sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in their lives, the future felt bright, full of promise and possibility.